He ran one of the most dangerous criminal organizations on the East Coast, controlled 3 shipping terminals, and had not done a single impulsive thing in over 2 decades. So why did Grant Ashford, the man Baltimore's waterfront knew simply as the Harbor, step between 2 armed enforcers and a broke nursing student outside a coin laundry on a rainy Wednesday night? It wasn't mercy. It wasn't conscience. Grant Ashford had methodically excised both of those things from himself before he turned 30. The real reason was sitting in the bottom of her cloth backpack, wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag, waiting 30 years for someone with enough of the past still alive inside them to understand what it meant. The rain came off the inner harbor in sheets that night, the kind of cold, indifferent Baltimore rain that soaks through everything and apologizes for nothing. Grant was seated in a back booth at Harborview Coin Laundry, a front operation tucked into the industrial fringe of Locust Point. Fluorescent lights, the perpetual smell of dryer sheets, and 3 washing machines that hadn't worked since the 90s. Across from him sat Bellamy Cruz, Deputy Director of Port Authority Inspections, a man whose chronic gambling debts had made him one of the most productive assets in Grant's portfolio. Cruz was sweating through his collar as he usually did, negotiating a timeline for a shipment manifest that needed to quietly cease to exist. Grant wasn't really listening. His attention had shifted, with the silent precision of a man who had survived 42 years by noticing things other people missed, to the young woman wiping down the folding tables near the back wall. Her name tag read Danny. She was maybe 24, dark hair pulled back, with the particular brand of exhaustion that didn't come from a single bad night but from a long sequence of them stacked end to end without a gap. She moved between customers with a mechanical efficiency that suggested her body had memorized the route so her mind could afford to be somewhere else. Grant recognized the look. He had worn it himself at 15, running errands for men whose names he'd been too frightened to say aloud. The door swung open before Cruz finished his sentence. 2 men walked in, heavy builds, wrong shoes for the weather, eyes that swept the room in the professional way that meant they weren't here to do laundry. Grant recognized the body language immediately. These were Kieran Doyle's street collectors. Doyle ran an Irish extortion outfit on the South Waterfront, a mid-level operation that Grant tolerated only because removing it would generate more noise than it was worth. The 2 men moved straight to the back. Danny Mercer, the larger one, a thick-necked enforcer the docs knew as Corgan, leaned across the folding table with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times before. Mr. Doyle doesn't like to wait on his collections. Danny set down her spray bottle. Her jaw tightened. I told your associate Friday, I get paid Thursday night. 48 hours. 48 hours is a luxury you stopped being able to afford, Corgan said, and reached for her wrist. Grant didn't move dramatically. He didn't need to. He simply stood, crossed the 12 feet between the booth and the folding tables in a silence that seemed to reconfigure the air in the room, and placed one hand over Corgan's forearm before the grip could close. She said Thursday. Grant's voice stayed low enough that only the 3 of them could hear it clearly. Walk out that door and let Doyle know he's collecting on streets he doesn't own. Corgan started to turn, already loading up a response, and then he looked into Grant Ashford's eyes and abandoned every word of it. The color left his face so thoroughly and so fast it was almost medically interesting. The 2 men left without another syllable, the door swinging shut in the wet night air behind them. Danny stared at Grant. Her chest was moving quickly, but her hands were still. Thank you, she said. You didn't have to do that. They were going to damage the equipment, Grant said flatly. He turned to walk back to the booth, and as he passed her in the narrow aisle between the machines, 30 years of muscles memory that predated every tailored suit and every legitimate holding company flared up without consulting him. His fingers grazed the cloth backpack hanging from the hook beside her station. One small, clean motion. The backpack slipped under his arm and into the booth in the same movement, unseen by everyone in the laundry, including Danny herself. He told himself it was professional instinct. Doyle sometimes used laundromat workers as low-level mules. He needed to know if the girl was part of something. The truth turned out to be considerably more complicated. The meeting with Bellamy Cruz concluded 10 minutes later. Grant walked out to the black SUV at the curb, climbed into the back, and waited until his driver pulled into traffic before he unzipped the backpack. He found the expected contents of a difficult life: a cracked pharmacology textbook, an open sleeve of crackers, a pay stub showing 63 hours worked in the past 2 weeks, a folded letter from Baltimore General Hospital suspending her clinical nursing placement pending an internal investigation. He found her wallet. He found a tube of hand cream and a set of hospital ID badge lanyards she hadn't returned when they suspended her. Then his hand found the inner zipper pocket and what was inside it. A Ziploc bag. He held it under the reading light above his seat. Inside was a hospital wristband, the old paper kind that clinics stopped issuing around the turn of the century. The ink had faded to the color of old bruises, but the text was still legible. Baltimore Children's Medical Center, Ward C, patient G. Ashford, age 12. Grant Ashford sat completely still for a long moment. Behind the wristband, folded into quarters and worn soft from years of handling, was a check. Payable to Ruth Mercer, $180,000. Signed, in a handwriting Grant knew better than almost anything else in the world, by his father, Victor Ashford. The date was March 3, 1997. Victor Ashford had died in a warehouse fire, in a closed casket service, in every story Grant had ever been told about his own past, on November 19, 1996. The check had been signed more than 3 months after the funeral. Grant sat in the moving car and held the paper and watched the harbor lights slide past the window and said nothing for a very long time. He did not sleep that night. He moved between the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse and the desk where the wristband and the check sat like 2 small ticking devices. If Victor had survived the fire, if someone had transported him somewhere, kept him alive, then the foundation Grant had built everything on for the last 26 years had never been what he believed it was. He had been 14 when Victor died. It was Prescott Halley who had appeared 3 days after the funeral, who had pulled him out of the group home, who had taught him the business and shaped him into what he had become. Prescott, his most trusted underboss. Prescott, the man who referred to himself, without any apparent irony, as the closest thing Grant had to family. Grant was on the phone with his head of intelligence before the sun came up. By noon, a folder sat on his desk. Danny Mercer, 24, third-year nursing student at the University of Maryland, clinical placement suspended on a charge she denied and her union representative called entirely without basis. Currently working double shifts at Harborview to pay down $90,000 in medical debt from her late mother's cancer treatment. Ruth Mercer had died 4 months ago. For 22 years prior to her illness, Ruth Mercer had worked as a private duty trauma nurse. Off-books placements, high-end clients, one clinic in particular. Grant ran the address, Lakeview Recovery Center, Lake Forest, operating from early 1995 to late 1998. Client files sealed under the original directorship of one Dr. F. Alston, deceased. A private trauma clinic, sealed records, operational during the exact window between November 1996 and March 1997. The picture developing in front of him was one he did not want to finish looking at. He found Danny Mercer in the alley, behind the laundromat, at 11:15 that night, standing against the brick wall with her face in her hands. She had noticed the backpack was missing. She looked like someone who had already lost enough things that one more was going to break something structural. Grant stepped out of the unmarked sedan he had chosen for exactly this kind of situation and crossed the alley. She heard his footsteps and looked up fast, and then recognized him, and some of the panic left her posture and was replaced by something more complicated. "You dropped this near the door," he said, and held the backpack out. "Looked like you were having a rough night." She crossed the alley and took the bag from his hands. He watched her skip past the wallet and the textbook and go straight to the inner pocket, and he watched the 1.5 inches of tension drop out of her spine when her fingers found the Ziploc bag still inside. "I thought I'd lost it," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. She pressed the bag to her chest. Thank you. I don't even know your name. Grant Merrill, he said. The alias came out cleanly. Years of use had made it automatic. I'm Danny. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and direct, and there was something in the way she held herself, spine straight despite the exhaustion, like someone who had decided years ago that posture was one thing she could control, that he found he couldn't look away from quickly. You keep appearing, Grant Merrill. Let me drive you home. South Baltimore after midnight isn't forgiving. She waited. He could see her doing it. Then exhaustion settled the question for her, and she nodded. The drive started quiet. Grant took the long route and kept the radio off and let the silence work. Danny sat with the backpack in her lap, watching the harbor lights smear across the wet glass. The things in the inner pocket, she said, after a while. They were my mother's. The check, Grant said. She glanced at him. You looked. I needed to know whether you were connected to the people who came for you. A silence, then something that was almost a short, tired laugh. Connected to them. She turned back to the window. My mother worked as a private nurse most of her life. Off the books, high-end clients. She told me once that at one of the clinics she worked, she saw something she was never meant to see. That a man came to her afterward and gave her a choice. Take money and leave Baltimore or face the same outcome as what she'd witnessed. Danny's hand found the backpack zipper by feel. She took me and left. I was 6 years old. We lived in 3 different cities before I turned 15. She never said who the man was, never said what she had seen. A pause. She gave me that check the week before she died. Said never to cash it unless I had absolutely no other option. Called it blood money from a ghost. Grant kept his hands easy on the wheel. Did you try to cash it? Last month, when Doyle's people started showing up, she unfolded the check and smoothed it flat on her knee. The account had been closed for 25 years. The man whose name is on it, Victor Ashford, I looked him up. Crime figure. Died in 1996. She shook her head slowly. My mother, the quietest, most careful person I've ever known. Grant parked in front of her building on Bear Street and put the car in park. He turned to face her in the low light coming through the windshield. I work in financial recovery, he said. Old accounts sometimes survive in holding structures the original account holder never knew about. Let me look into that check. Danny frowned. Why, we've spoken twice. Because Doyle's people are going to keep coming, he said. He paused, and then said the true thing without entirely planning to. And because you remind me of someone I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I was 12 years old, and I only just this evening started to understand why. She looked at him carefully. Her eyes moved across his face and then dropped to his left forearm, where the jacket sleeve had pulled back slightly, revealing a ridge of old scar tissue from an IV site, poorly placed, poorly healed, the kind of mark that came from an understaffed ward with too many patients and not enough of anything else. Her breathing changed. There was a boy, she said slowly, quietly, as if she were reading something written a long way back. When I was little, I was in Ward B. There was a boy across the courtyard in Ward C, and he was always alone. No one ever came. I used to. The rear windshield came apart. If you're still with me right now, go ahead and hit that like button. Because what happens in the next few minutes is going to change everything you thought you understood about this story. Grant had Danny's head below the dashboard before the second shot landed. He threw the sedan into reverse and floored it, the engine tearing itself open, the car rocketing backward down Bear Street through a spread of fire that sparked off the reinforced hood and punched holes in the door panels. He could feel the chassis absorbing things it had been built to absorb. He couldn't feel the shrapnel that had opened a cut along his left shoulder. Not yet. Stay down, flat precise, not a shout. He spun the car at the intersection, tires screaming against wet asphalt, and plunged into the corridor of industrial streets running south toward the rail yard. 3 vehicles in pursuit, professional spacing, coordinated fields of fire. These were not Doyle's people. Doyle's people drove older Fords and shot with considerably less discipline. Someone else had sent them. He lost the pursuit inside 8 minutes, cutting through service access roads below the interstate. that only someone who had spent 20 years operating on Baltimore's infrastructure would have had any reason to know existed. He brought them to a safe address above a vacant commercial space on Key Highway, registered to a holding company, unremarkable, used by his organization for exactly these moments. He locked the door. He turned on one lamp. Danny Mercer was sitting on the edge of the couch, with her hands folded in her lap, not shaking. The shock was either still on its way, or she had considerably more spine than the situation had any obligation to produce. She looked at him with clear, steady eyes. "You're not in financial recovery," she said. "No. Who are you?" He sat in the chair across from her. "My name is Grant Ashford." The silence after that was long enough to hear the rain against the window glass. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth, then something clicked into place behind her eyes. "Victor Ashford," she said. "The check." "My father." "Your father." She let that sit for a moment. "Then my mother. She was the nurse on duty the night someone came to finish what the fire started." Her voice was steady, but her eyes had filled. "She spent 30 years running from that. She never told me what she'd seen because telling me would have put a target on you," Grant said. The words came out rougher than he meant them. Danny stood, went to the kitchen without asking, ran water, returned with a folded cloth. She sat on the coffee table across from him and began working on his shoulder, the shrapnel cut, visible now that the jacket was damaged, with the quiet focus of someone who had done ER clinical rotations and hadn't yet forgotten any of it. "My mother called me her little sparrow," she said, working. "She said I had sparrow instincts, that I turned up where I wasn't expected and brought things to people who needed them without understanding why." Grant went very still. For a moment, seated in that dim room with the rain against the glass, he didn't move at all. Then, with a deliberateness that she would later describe as one of the strangest things she had ever witnessed, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the one his security team had never been asked to inventory, and removed a small, folded piece of paper, worn soft with age. Laminated at some point, the plastic yellowed and bubbled at the corners. He held it out. Danny's hands stopped moving. She took it and unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn card on construction paper, the corners rounded down to almost nothing. Two crayon figures, standing in what appeared to be a courtyard with a window behind one and a brick wall behind the other. At the bottom, in a child's careful block printing, "Get well soon. From your little sparrow, Danny." Her eyes came up to his face very slowly. "I have carried that since I was 12 years old," Grant said. "The orderly told me a little girl from Ward B left it on the courtyard ledge. I never knew her name. I looked afterward. The ward had discharged her with no forwarding information." He held her gaze. "I didn't know who Danny was." Danny's breath had gone uneven. "My mother checked us out the morning after she witnessed what happened at the clinic. We were on a bus to Cincinnati before noon." She looked at the card. Her hand was trembling slightly. "You kept this for 30 years. It was the only kind thing anyone offered me that month," he said. 2 hours later, the routing trace on the check came back from his forensic accountant. The holding account had passed through 4 layers of shell documentation before landing in a private equity vehicle called Anchor Capital Group. Anchor Capital Group was registered to Prescott Halley. Grant sat with that information for a long time before he moved. The shape of it assembled itself with a cold, grinding clarity. Victor Ashford had survived the November warehouse fire, injured severely, transported in secret to Lakeview Recovery Center, where Ruth Mercer had been the nurse on duty. Victor had lived long enough to write a check payable to the woman keeping him alive. Perhaps as payment, perhaps as a last piece of insurance, a document that would only mean something if someone followed it far enough. Prescott Halley had found out Victor survived. He had gone to Lakeview. Ruth Mercer had been working that night. And Prescott, the man who had claimed the vacant throne by telling a grieving 14-year-old boy that his father's enemies had killed him, had used a forged signature to pay the witness to disappear, and then had spent the next 28 years directing the dead man's sons to wage war against every other family in Baltimore, a war for a murder that Prescott himself had committed aimed at everyone except the person responsible. Grant drove to the waterfront alone at 2 in the morning. The South Baltimore shipping yards at that hour existed in a particular kind of quiet: dark water, crane shadows, the sound of lines moving against cleats. Grant stood under a work light on Pier 7 and sent one encrypted message to Prescott Halley's phone. Survive the hit. Believe it was Doyle. Need immediate extraction. Pier 7. Come alone. He knew Prescott would not send people. A secret held for 28 years did not get delegated at the moment it began to surface. The headlights appeared at 2:47. Prescott Halley stepped out of a Navigator, silver-haired, unhurried, wearing the expression of a man arriving to rescue someone he was relieved to still have use for. 2 guards positioned behind him. Grant. Prescott crossed the wet concrete with his arms slightly open. When I heard the radio chatter, I thought we'd lost you. He glanced past Grant's shoulder. Where's the girl? Grant had not mentioned Danny in the message. I didn't say anything about a girl, Grant said. Prescott stopped walking. The harbor moved against the pilings. The halogen light hummed above them. Doyle's people have been tracking her, Prescott said smoothly. I assumed. Doyle didn't send those hitters. Grant reached into his coat and held up the check in the work light. I found this in Ruth Mercer's belongings, $180,000, signed by my father, dated 3 months after the funeral you walked me to. He let the paper catch the light. The account traces to Anchor Capital, which traces to you. The smooth surface of Prescott Halley held for a moment and then shifted, and what came through underneath was not panic. It was something older, an exhaustion that had been carried a very long way. Your father was cooperating with a federal task force, Prescott said. His voice was flat and final, the voice of a man delivering a verdict he had rehearsed many times in private. He had already made contact. He intended to hand over 2 decades of operational records and put us all in front of a grand jury. Everything your grandfather built, everything I spent my entire life protecting. I did what the organization required. And then I gave you everything I could give. I gave you a purpose. I gave you an empire. You gave me a war against people who hadn't done anything, Grant said. You aimed me at the wrong direction for 28 years. Look at what you became, Prescott said. I know what I became, Grant said. I built it on a lie you told a 14-year-old boy standing at an empty coffin. He had spent the hour before driving to the pier, presenting his 6 most senior people with the forensic documentation of the account transfer, laid out in terms that admitted no other interpretation. In the organization Grant Ashford ran, killing the boss was the one act without redemption. Covering it for 3 decades while pointing the murdered man's son at innocent rivals was something for which the organization had no vocabulary, because no one had previously required one. The red laser points appeared on Prescott's chest from 3 separate positions simultaneously. Grant's people came out from behind the containers and the crane base, and the shadows between the shipping infrastructure, quiet and convergent, closing the perimeter. Prescott looked around the pier. His guards had already set their weapons on the concrete without being asked. The Navigator's engine was still running and had nowhere to go. You cannot run this without me, Prescott said. His voice had thinned considerably. I'm not going to run it, Grant said. After a moment, 2 shots rang out over the harbor, and the secret that had cost so many people so much. Ruth Mercer's 30 years of fear, Danny's disrupted life, Victor Ashford's unmarked ending, and 28 years of misdirected grief was finally, irrevocably, put to rest. The Baltimore morning came in clean gold off the water. For about an hour before the city properly woke up, the harbor light turned everything it touched into something that looked, briefly, worth protecting. Danny Mercer walked out of Baltimore General Hospital's administrative offices at 8:49 in the morning with a manila envelope in her hand. Inside was a formal letter of reinstatement from the hospital board, acknowledging that the controlled substance diversion charge had been found to lack any evidentiary foundation, and restoring her clinical nursing placement effective immediately. The second paragraph noted, almost as an afterthought, that her late mother's outstanding medical balance had been satisfied in full by an anonymous charitable contribution processed the previous evening. She stood at the top of the hospital steps. She breathed the morning air. She read the letter a second time to make sure it said what she thought it said. At the bottom of the steps, parked at the curb, was a dark green car, older model, no markings, the kind of vehicle that was chosen specifically because it did not announce itself. And leaning against the hood with his hands in the pockets of a plain jacket, no suit, no armor of any kind, was Grant Ashford. The scar on his forearm was visible in the morning light. Danny came down the steps and stopped in front of him. "The news this morning is saying there's been a major reorganization," she said, "that the principal has stepped back and can't be reached for comment." "I heard something like that," Grant said. "Is it true?" He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and held out the laminated card, not handing it back the way you return something borrowed, but offering it the way you offer something you have held in trust for a long time and are finally able to return to its owner. "I think it belongs with you," he said quietly. "It always did." Danny took it from his hand. Her fingers rested on his for a moment longer than necessary. "What do you do now?" she asked. "I have some legitimate interests in port logistics I've been ignoring for years," Grant said. "And I owe a debt to a little sparrow that I've been carrying around without understanding what it was." The corner of his mouth moved, an expression that had not had much use in a long time. 30 years is long enough to owe something. Danny looked at the card in her palm. Then she looked at him, this man who had built an empire out of grief and misdirected fury, who had carried a child's crayon drawing in his inside pocket for 3 decades. Without knowing who Danny was, who had stolen a backpack looking for a threat and instead found the one thing no amount of money or violence had been able to recover for him, the truth, and the person who had unknowingly kept it safe all along. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and Grant Ashford held on with the uncomplicated steadiness of a man who had finally stopped fighting something he should have been moving toward all along. Her mother had taken the blood money from a ghost and spent her life running, but she had also, without knowing it, kept every piece of evidence that mattered, the wristband, the check, the connection, and placed it in the hands of the one person who would eventually walk it into exactly the right room. He had opened her backpack looking for danger. What he found instead rewrote everything, including him. What hit you hardest in this story, the moment Grant recognized that hospital wristband, or when he pulled out that 30-year-old card? Tell us in the comments. And if this one found its way to you tonight, share it with someone who needs it, hit that like button, and subscribe to Sadie's Romance Library. We have more waiting, and we will see you in the next one.